This is Taylor and Marian's Slave Narrative Project. The first narrative we used was Frederick Douglass, and he was a prominent African-American abolitionist, author, and orator. Born a slave, Douglass escaped at age 20 and went on to become a world-renowned anti-slavery activist. The next narrative we used was Harriet Tubman's. Harriet Tubman was an American bondwoman who escaped from slavery in the South to become a leading abolitionist before the American Civil War. She was born in Maryland in 1820 and successfully escaped in 1849. The next narrative we used was Celia's. For 19-year-old Celia, a slave on a Missouri farm, 5 years of being repeatedly raped by her middle-aged owner was enough. On the night of June 23, 1855, she would later tell a reporter, "The devil got into me," and Celia fatally clubbed her master as he approached her in her cabin. The next narrative was Solomon Northup's. Born in July 1808 in New York, Solomon Northup grew up a free man working as a farmer and violinist while having a family. He was lured to the South and kidnapped in 1841 and enslaved for more than a decade. Northup was freed in 1853 with the help of colleagues and friends. The next narrative we used was Thomas H. Jones. He was born a slave in Wilmington, North Carolina, and was a prominent African-American abolitionist in antebellum America. Jones escaped slavery, traveled to Canada, and subsequently relocated to Massachusetts. African slaves were brought over from Africa and sold to Americans. They were fed lard, cornmeal, molasses, and a bit of meat, flour, peas, and other greens from their slave owners. Clothing, distributed by the master, usually once a year and often at Christmas time, was apportioned according to sex and age as well as to the labor performed by its wearer. Children, for instance, often went unclothed entirely until they reached adolescence. Elderly slaves who could not do physical labor were not given the shoes for extra layers of clothing during the winter that younger field workers were. Shelter provided by slave owners was also meager. Many slaves lived in small stick houses with dirt floors, not the log cabins often depicted in books and films. These shelters had cracks in the walls that let in cold and wind, and had only thin coverings over the windows. Again, slave owners supplied only the minimum needed for survival. By the eve of the Civil War, Christianity had pervaded the slave community. Not all slaves were Christian, nor were all those who accepted Christianity members of a church, but the doctrines, symbols, and vision of life preached by Christianity were familiar to most. The religion of the slaves was both visible and invisible, formally organized and spontaneously adapted. Regular Sunday worship in the local church was paralleled by illicit or at least informal prayer meetings on weeknights in the slave cabins. Field slave was not easy. A field slave worked from sunrise to sunset. During harvest, they worked an 18-hour day. A field worker was out in the field when the first sign of light, and then until it was too dark to see. Women field workers worked the same hours as men. Women that were expected to work until the child was born, and after the child's birth, the woman worked with the child on her back. After a day on a cotton plantation, the slaves got in a line to have their cotton weighed and receive their daily food. The minimum amount of cotton to be picked in one day was 200 pounds. The field slaves were driven all day long by a white overseer with a whip.